All right, so are you ready to completely crush this React interview?
I am so ready.
Okay, fantastic. Me too. Today, we are diving deep, and I mean deep, into top React interview questions and answers.
Sounds good.
It's a pretty dense document, so we're here to pull out the stuff that'll actually, help you land that job.
Yes,
Expert speaker, you ready to unpack this beast with me?
absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, so React. We're talking single-page applications, super smooth, fast-loading websites.
Yeah, those are the best.
That's
Yeah.
right. What is it about React that makes those, lightning-fast experiences possible?
Well, React is all about efficiency.
Okay.
You see, traditional web development often means reloading the entire page every time something changes.
Right.
React's like, hold on, let's be smarter about this. It uses something called a virtual DOM.
Okay, now I've heard that term thrown around a lot. Well, virtual DOM,
Yeah.
honestly. What does that even mean for me when I'm sitting in that interview chair?
It's all about speed and how React updates what you see on the screen. Imagine you're redecorating your house.
Okay.
But instead of repainting the whole house, every time you want to change one wall, you just repaint that one wall, right?
Right.
The virtual DOM is like React's blueprint. It figures out exactly what needs to change and only updates that part. Less work, way faster.
So when that interviewer throws a performance question my way,
Mm,
understanding the virtual DOM is going to be, key.
precisely. Now, the document mentions JSX, which is how we write React code.
Right.
It looks a lot like HTML,
It does, yeah.
which can be comforting for new developers.
Yeah, for sure. JSX, it definitely makes that learning curve less steep.
For sure.
But is it actually HTML? Or is it some sort of React-specific thing?
It's kind of a bit of both.
Okay.
JSX lets us write this HTML-like code, but with all the power of JavaScript right inside.
Okay.
Then behind the scenes, React takes that JSX and turns it into regular JavaScript that the browser understands.
That's so clever. It's like having your cake and eating it too.
Yeah.
Speaking of clever, the document dives into components, which
Yeah.
are like the Lego bricks of a React app, right?
Exactly, yeah.
We've got two main types, class components and functional components. So break it down for me. What's the difference?
Think of class components like the deluxe Lego bricks. They have more features built in, like the ability to manage internal data, which we call state,
Okay.
and lifecycle methods, which are basic functions that run at different stages of a component's life.
Okay, so class components are the ones with all the bells and whistles. What about functional components then?
Yeah.
When would I use those?
Functional components are your simple, elegant bricks. They take in data and spit out what you see on the screen. They used to be just for simpler tasks, but then React 16.8 came along and bam, hooks changed the game.
It sounds like some secret weapon.
Pretty much, yeah. Hooks let you use state and lifecycle methods directly within those functional components. So now you can often write your entire component as a sleek, reusable function.
So functional components with hooks are like those multi-tools. They can do it all.
Yeah.
Speaking of tools, the document also talks about a distinction that trips a lot of people up. Props versus state.
Yeah.
Help us out here, expert speaker. What are they and why should I care in an interview?
This is huge. Understanding props and state shows you understand how data flows in a React application.
Okay.
Props, which is short for properties, are how you pass data down from a parent component to a child component. It's a one-way street.
Like sending a care package down to college. What's sent is sent.
Exactly.
Okay. So then what is state?
State is a component's own little world of data that it manages internally.
Okay.
Think of it like a light switch.
Okay.
It can be on or off. That's its state. Now imagine you're building a more complex app, like that temperature converter example from the document.
Oh, yeah. The one where you type in Celsius and it instantly shows you Fahrenheit.
Exactly.
And vice versa.
Yes, exactly. You wouldn't want each input field managing its own temperature state.
No.
That'd get messy fast. Instead, you lift state up to a parent component.
Okay.
Now that parent component holds the true temperature and passes down the converted values as props to each input field.
Got it.
Keeps everything in sync beautifully.
Okay. So lifting state up is like having a single source of truth.
Yes.
So best practice. Interviewers will eat that up.
Yes.
Speaking of things, interviewers love life cycle methods.
Yes.
It sounds a bit technical.
It does.
Expert speaker, can you break down why they're important?
Imagine a component's life like a theatrical performance. It gets mounted onto the stage, the DOM.
Good.
It might update its performance based on cues. And eventually, it takes its final bow and unmounts. Lifecycle methods give you hooks into each stage of that performance.
So like a stage manager, I can control what happens at each key moment.
Precisely. For example, component did mount is a lifecycle method that runs right after a component appears on the stage.
Okay.
That's your chance to fetch data from an API, set up timers, or do any setup work.
Got it. And component will unmount, that's like the curtain call, right?
Exactly. It's your last chance to clean up before the component disappears. Super important for things like removing event listeners to avoid those nasty memory leaks.
Okay.
Imagine leaving a microphone on after the play is over. It could cause all sorts of feedback and chaos.
Yeah, for sure. You don't want to be that developer who brings down the whole production because they forgot to clean up after themselves.
Exactly.
So we've covered a component's life cycle, but what about those unexpected moments when things go wrong? Are there tools in React to, like, handle that gracefully?
Great question.
Yeah.
That's where error boundaries come in. The under trapeze artists. If something goes wrong, they're there to catch it.
Ah, okay. So the entire app doesn't come crashing down if there's an error in one tiny component.
Exactly. You wrap the potentially problematic parts of your code with an error boundary. If an error occurs, the boundary catches it and lets you display a user-friendly message or even attempt to recover gracefully.
Now that's what I call a good show, even with a few hiccups along the way.
Exactly.
Speaking of shows, we got to talk about navigation.
Yeah.
Especially for those single-page apps where it needs to be super smooth. The document mentions React Router. What's the deal with that?
React Router. Your trusty stagehand for managing scene transitions. It lets you define different routes in your app,
Okay.
each associated with a specific component or view. And the best part, it updates the URL without requiring a full page reload, making the navigation feel super snappy.
So when I see those clean, bookmarkable URLs, that's likely React Router doing its thing.
You got it. And there are different router components for different situations. The most common one you'll likely use and be asked about in interviews is the browser router, which uses the HTML5 history API to give you those nice, clean URLs.
So if an interviewer asks about SEO,
Hmm?
which is all about websites ranking well in search results,
Yeah,
that's where understanding browser router comes in handy.
you got it.
Okay.
Now, sometimes you need to manage a lot of data, and it can get chaotic.
Oh, yeah.
For those situations, there's Redux.
Okay.
It sounds intimidating,
It does.
but what's the elevator pitch?
Yeah, give me the quick version.
Think of Redux as your super organized backstage manager
Okay.
for your application's data or state.
Okay.
Instead of having props and states scattered everywhere, Redux says, everyone listen up, we have one central source of truth.
And no more data silos. Everyone on the same page.
Exactly. And the beautiful thing is, you can only change this central state in very specific, controlled ways. You dispatch actions, which are basically like messages describing what happened, like, hey, a new to-do item was added. And then reducers, these pure functions, take that action and the current state and return a brand new, updated state.
Okay.
No messing with the original state directly.
So Redux is all about predictability and making your state easy to reason about.
Exactly.
And that makes debugging a whole lot easier. Speaking of debugging, let's talk about testing. The document mentions Jest and React test utils. Why is testing so crucial, especially for interview prep?
Imagine building a complex stage set without testing if each piece actually works.
Oh, no.
Testing is your way of making sure that as your React app grows, everything still behaves as expected.
Okay.
Jest is your go-to testing framework. Super powerful and works seamlessly with React.
So it's like doing a dress rehearsal for my code. Make sure each part works before that big opening night.
Perfect analogy. And then there's React Test Utils, which is specifically designed for testing React components. It lets you simulate user interactions like clicks and key presses, gives you tools to inspect the output of your components, all without running your app in a real browser.
Nice. Okay, so testing, non-negotiable.
Yes.
But now, let's get to the heart of it. What are some of those specific React interview questions this document covers? Where do things tend to trip people up?
One common question is how to update objects in your component state.
Okay.
It's tempting to just directly change the state, but that's a big no-no in React.
Because we want to avoid those React state management side effects, right?
Right.
Yes. Got to play by React's rules.
Right. Directly changing state can lead to unexpected issues.
Okay.
Instead, you want to treat state as immutable. Always make a copy,
Okay.
update the copy, and then use React's setState method to update the state with your new copy.
So what's the most Reacty way to update objects without causing any chaos.
Spread syntax is your friend.
Okay.
Let's say your state is an object with a name and age.
Okay.
Instead of directly changing age, you'd write set state dot state age 31.
Okay.
That little state does the magic of copying everything over, and then you just overwrite the age property.
It's like using a stencil to make sure you get a clean copy every time.
Yes.
So much cleaner.
Exactly.
More efficient. Another question the document highlights is looping inside JSX. Now, this one throws a lot of people for a loop, pun intended.
Yeah.
What's the deal here?
It's all about how JSX plays with JavaScript.
Yeah.
You can't use those classic for loops directly in your JSX.
Right.
Instead, you think about those handy array methods JavaScript gives you, like map.
Okay.
Yeah, map is like that trusty Swiss Army knife, and it always has the right tool for the job.
It really does.
Exactly. Let's say you've got an array of to-do items you want to display.
Okay.
You can use map to loop through that array. And for each item, return a nice JSX element representing that to-do.
Okay.
Just remember to give each element a unique key. That's React's way of keeping track of things efficiently.
Ah, keys.
Yes.
Those are crucial for React to efficiently update the DOM, right?
Yes.
It's like giving each item a little name tag so React doesn't get confused.
Exactly.
Speaking of potentially confusing them,
Ah.
the document also mentions refs.
Ah, yes.
Now, I've heard whispers about refs,
Mhm.
and they seem a bit like magic or maybe even a bit of a necessary evil.
Yeah.
What's the deal with them?
Refs are interesting. They're like getting backstage access to the DOM, that underlying structure of your web page. You can use refs to directly interact with a specific element, like focusing on an input field.
Okay, but the document stresses using them sparingly. Why is that?
Refs can be tempting, but overusing them can make your code less Reacty. It's usually a sign that you might be able to achieve what you need in a more elegant way. But there are some valid situations, for example, managing focus, like I mentioned, or integrating with a third-party library that doesn't play nicely with React's usual ways.
It's like sometimes you need to talk to the stage manager directly, but for the most part, it's best to let the actors and the stagehands do their thing.
Exactly.
Speaking of stagehands, we briefly touched on Redux earlier.
Yes.
The document also mentions Redux Saga and Redux Thunk.
Yes.
These sound like characters from a fantasy novel.
We do.
What are those all about, and why are they relevant for interviews?
Yes. Redux Saga and Redux Thunk are your trusty sidekicks for handling those actions in your application that need to interact with the outside world.
Okay, break that down for me. What do you mean by interact with the outside world?
Think about things like fetching data from an API, saving something to local storage in the browser, or setting timers, things that go beyond simply updating the state in your Redux store.
So they're like those backstage crew members who handle the special effects and pyrotechnics.
Exactly. Reducers, which handle state updates in Redux, are supposed to be pure functions, predictable and only relying on their inputs.
Okay.
Side effects are messy and can make things unpredictable. Redux Thunk and Redux Saga help you manage those messy bits in a controlled way.
So they keep those side effects from wreaking havoc on our nicely organized Redux state.
Precisely. Redux Thunk is the more straightforward approach.
Okay.
It lets you write functions that can dispatch multiple actions, which is super handy for things like API calls. You can dispatch one action to start the request and another one to update the state when the request is complete.
Got it. And Redux Saga, that's the one that uses generators, right? What are those all about?
Yes. Redux Saga uses generators, which are special functions that can be paused and resumed, to create these elegant flows for managing side effects. It can be a bit more advanced, but can make complex asynchronous logic way more readable.
So Redux Saga is like the choreographer for our side effects, keeping everything synchronized, running smoothly.
Exactly.
So should I be like diving deep into Redux Saga for my interviews, or is that overkill?
That depends on the level of the role you're interviewing for. If it's a junior position, having a basic understanding of side effects and maybe Redux Thunk should suffice. But for more senior roles, interviewers might dig deeper into your experience with managing complex side effects. So being familiar with Redux Saga could definitely give you an edge.
Okay, good to know. Now, before we wrap up this first act of our React interview, deep dive styled components, are those just fancy CSS?
Styled components are a way to write CSS, but right inside your JavaScript components. It's like giving your components their own personal stylists. This keeps your styles organized, prevents conflicts, and makes them way more maintainable.
So no more searching through a massive CSS file trying to figure out what style's what. I love that. And lastly, the document briefly mentioned some other libraries, Redux Form and Reselect. Are those essential for me to know, like inside and out?
Like Redux Saga, it depends on the level you're aiming for. Redux Form can save you a ton of time and headache if you're dealing with lots of forms, especially in larger applications.
Okay.
It helps you manage form state, validation, and submission all within your Redux flow.
So definitely something worth looking into if forms are going to be a big part of my React life.
Exactly. And Reselect is all about optimization within Redux.
Okay.
It lets you create mem-wise selectors, basically. It caches the results of expensive computations so your app doesn't have to redo them every time.
Talk about efficient. It's
Yeah.
like having those pre-calculated answers handy so you don't have to pull out the calculator every time.
Exactly. Now, while these libraries are great, don't feel overwhelmed if you don't have deep experience with all of them.
Right.
The key is to show that you understand their purpose, when they're useful, and how they fit into the bigger picture of building robust and performant React applications.
That's fantastic advice, expert speaker. It's not just about memorizing syntax, it's about understanding the why and the how, and showcasing your ability to learn and adapt. We've covered a ton of ground in this first part, from the virtual DOM to components, props, state, lifecycle methods, error boundaries, routing, testing, and even dipped our toes into the world of Redux and styling.
And don't forget side effects.
Ah, yes, side effects.
Yeah.
Those sneaky but essential parts of many React applications. We've equipped you with a solid foundation for tackling those interview questions.
Oh,
But there's so much more to explore.
so much more. It's a bit like a theatrical production, isn't it? We've set the stage, introduced the main players,
Right.
and now it's time to delve into the nuances of the performance.
I like that. Act 2, where things get really interesting. Yes.
And speaking of interesting, the document mentions performance optimization. Now, that's a topic I imagine comes up a lot in interviews.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Interviewers want to know you're not just writing code, you're writing efficient code.
Right.
And React has some tricks up its sleeve. Remember those potentially expensive tasks we talked about?
Yeah.
Well, React lets you memorize them.
Memwise. Sounds a bit like memorize. Is that what's going on here?
In a way, yes. It's like having React keep a cheat sheet.
Okay.
Let's say you have a component that does some heavy calculation. With memoization, you tell React to remember the result. So the next time that component is called with the same inputs, React's like, hold on, I've already done this. I've already done this work, and just gives you the cached result.
So it's like having a shortcut for those computationally intensive tasks.
Exactly.
That's brilliant.
Yes.
Does React have a specific way to do that?
It does. React has a built-in function called memo.
You wrap your component with it, and React handles the memoization magic behind the scenes. This is especially useful for components that render frequently or have complex calculations within them.
Okay, so memoization is one tool in our performance optimization toolbox.
Mm-hmm.
What else can we do to, make sure our React apps are running smoothly?
Another important technique is using the should component update lifecycle method.
Okay.
This gives you fine-grained control over when a component should re-render.
So instead of React automatically re-rendering everything whenever something changes,
Yes.
I can step in and say, hold on, only update this component if these specific things have changed.
Precisely. You can compare the incoming props and state to the previous ones, and if nothing relevant has changed, you can tell React to skip the re-render,
Okay.
saving precious time and resources.
That's awesome. It's like having a really efficient stage manager who knows exactly which parts of the set need adjusting and which ones can stay put.
Yes.
Speaking of stage management, the document mentions something called HOCs, higher order components.
Yes.
Now that sounds a bit intimidating.
It does sound intimidating, doesn't it?
Are HOCs something I need to be fluent in for interviews?
HOCs are a powerful pattern in React, but don't let the name scare you.
Okay.
Think of them like those versatile stagehands who can take on different roles depending on the production.
Okay, so how do those stagehand HOCs actually work in React?
A higher order component is essentially a function that takes a component
Okay.
and returns a new enhanced component. It's like giving your component a power-up.
Can you give me a concrete example of when I'd actually use an HOC?
Absolutely. Imagine you have several components that need to fetch data from an API.
Okay.
Instead of writing the same data fetching logic in each component, you can create an HOC that handles that for you.
Okay.
The HOC would fetch the data and then pass it down as props to the component it's wrapping.
So it's like having a dedicated crew member who handles all the data logistics, freeing up the actors to focus on their performance.
Exactly.
That's super efficient.
HOCs are a great way to abstract away common logic and make your components more reusable and maintainable. Now, speaking of things that can get messy, let's revisit side effects for a moment.
Okay.
We talked about Redux Thunk and Redux Saga for managing them earlier, but why all the fuss about side effects anyway?
Yeah, I remember thinking, okay, side effects, those sound kind of messy. But why do they need this special treatment in Redux?
It all goes back to predictability.
Okay.
Remember how reducers, those pure functions in Redux, are supposed to be predictable?
Right.
They should take the current state and an action and consistently return the same new state every time.
Right.
Side effects introduce this element of unpredictability because they're interacting with things outside of Redux's control.
So it's like having a rogue stagehand who starts improvising during the play.
Oh, yes.
It could be entertaining, but it also might throw the whole production off track.
A perfect analogy. Redux Thunk and Redux Saga are there to bring those rogue stagehands back in line. They give you a structured way to handle those side effects without messing up the predictability of your reducers.
So Redux Thunk is like the assistant director who whispers cues to the rogue stagehand, keeping them somewhat on script, while Redux Saga is like the choreographer who integrates those unscripted moments into a cohesive dance.
I love those analogies. You've got it exactly right. And understanding the difference between those approaches and when you might choose one over the other is valuable knowledge for React interviews.
It sounds like Redux Saga is the way to go for those really complex scenarios, while Redux Thunk might be a good starting point for simpler side effects.
Precisely. Now let's zoom out a bit and talk about some of those additional libraries and tools that live within the React universe. We already mentioned React Router and styled components.
Right.
But the document also touches on a few others that might spark an interviewer's curiosity.
Yeah, there's so many tools in the React ecosystem. It can feel a bit overwhelming, especially when prepping for interviews.
It's true. The key is to prioritize. We already touched upon Redux Form, which can be a lifesaver when dealing with complex forms.
Right.
And I remember you mentioning Reselect, which helps optimize Redux by memoizing the results of selectors.
Yes.
These libraries are fantastic to have in your toolkit, but even more important than knowing every single one inside and out is understanding their purpose.
Okay.
And when they might be the right tool for the job, being able to articulate that in an interview is gold.
Okay, so understanding the why behind the tools is just as important as knowing how to use them.
Yes.
Now, for those of us dreaming of building mobile apps, the document mentions React Native.
Yes.
Is this where our React skills become superpower level?
React Native is amazing. It lets you build native mobile apps using your React knowledge.
Wait, so I can use JavaScript, the language of the web, to build apps that feel right at home on my phone.
You got it.
That's incredible.
It is. React Native takes the core concepts of React components, props, state, and applies them to building mobile UIs. You're still writing React code, but instead of rendering web elements, you're rendering native components.
So under the hood, it's still using those native components, which means the performance is going to be top-notch.
Exactly. And you can share a lot of code between your web and mobile apps, which is a huge win for development speed and consistency. Now, there's one crucial concept in React Native that interviewers might ask about: the bridge.
The bridge, what is that all about?
Think of it like this. Your JavaScript code and the native platform your app is running on speak different languages. The bridge is the interpreter,
Okay.
enabling communication between the two.
So when I write set state in my React Native code, it's the bridge that relays that information to the native side to actually update the UI.
Exactly. It's important to be mindful of this bridge because too much back and forth can slow things down.
Okay, so efficiency is key, just like with web development.
Mm.
And speaking of efficiency, how do we ensure our React Native apps are running smoothly? The document mentions testing, but is it the same as testing our web apps?
The principles are similar, but the tools and environments differ. You'll still use Jest for unit testing,
Okay.
but you'll also want to test on simulators and, ideally, real devices to catch platform-specific quirks.
So it's not just about making sure the logic works, but also ensuring it looks and feels right on different screen sizes operating systems.
You got it. And this is where those error boundaries we discussed earlier come in handy again.
Okay.
They work in React Native too, providing that safety net to catch errors and prevent your app from crashing.
Those error boundaries are like the universal safety measure protecting our apps, whether they're on the web or on our phones.
Yes.
Now, before we move on to our final act, I want to revisit state management.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about Redux.
We have.
But the document mentions other options, like MobX and Context API. Should I be, well-versed in all of them for interviews?
It's like having different sets of tools for different stages. For smaller productions, React's built-in state management might be enough.
Okay.
But for larger, more intricate productions, you'll need something more powerful.
Right.
That's where Redux shines.
So Redux is like having a dedicated stage management team for those complex productions.
Precisely. And then you have other approaches, like MobX, which takes a more reactive approach to state management.
Right.
It can be a good choice for certain situations, but it's not as widely used as Redux.
Okay, so Redux is still the heavy hitter in the state management world.
Yes.
But what about this context API? It sounds kind of mysterious.
Context API is React's built-in way to share data across your component tree without explicitly passing props down at every level.
Okay.
Imagine needing to share a small prop with a component deeply nested within your app.
Okay.
With context, you can provide that data globally.
So context is like having a shared bulletin board backstage, where components can access common information without bothering every single level above them.
You got it. It's great for things like theme information or user authentication status, which many components might need access to. However, use it judiciously.
Okay.
Overusing context can make your components harder to reuse and test.
It's like anything else. The key is to use the right tool for the job.
Exactly.
We've covered so much in this act alone. Performance optimization, HOCs, side effect management, even dipping our toes into the world of React Native and alternative state management solutions.
Right.
It's a lot.
It is, but it's about showing interviewers that you understand the breadth of the React landscape, even if you haven't mastered every single tool.
Right.
The important thing is to demonstrate your ability to learn, adapt, and choose the right approach for the task at hand.
Love it. And we are back for the final act of our React interview deep dive. We've covered the essentials, explored some advanced territory.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. Are you ready to really, solidify those React skills?
Absolutely. Let's unveil those final secrets.
Okay.
That will make you shine in your interview.
Yes, love it. Okay, so imagine I'm in that interview, feeling pretty good about my React knowledge, and then, bam, the interviewer hits me with a question about React's reconciliation algorithm.
Oh.
How do I handle that curveball?
Don't worry, it's not as scary as it sounds.
Okay, good.
Remember how we talked about the virtual DOM being React's blueprint?
Right.
Well, the reconciliation algorithm is like the construction crew that takes that blueprint and figures out the most efficient way to update the actual building.
Okay, so it's all about making those updates to what we see on screen as smooth and fast as possible. But how does it actually work? What's going on behind the scenes?
React's reconciliation algorithm is all about minimizing the amount of work the browser has to do.
Okay.
It does this by making some clever assumptions and using some smart techniques. One key idea is that elements of the same type, in the same position in the component tree, are likely representing the same thing, even if their props have changed.
So if I have a list of items and I update one of them, React doesn't need to re-render the entire list.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
And to make this process even more efficient, React uses keys. Remember how we talked about giving each element in a list a unique key?
Right.
That helps React keep track of which elements are new, which ones have changed, and which ones have been removed.
Keys are like those little labels you put on moving boxes.
Yes.
They help React unpack and arrange everything in the right spot without too much fuss.
I love it.
Now, speaking of organization, let's circle back to Context API. We touched upon it earlier, but how can I use it effectively? And, more importantly, how do I show an interviewer that I understand its power and its pitfalls?
Context API is a fantastic tool for sharing data globally, but like any powerful tool, it needs to be handled with care.
Okay.
Imagine using a chainsaw to prune a rose bush. Probably not the best approach, right?
Right.
Similarly, overusing context can make your components less reusable and harder to test.
Okay, so moderation is key. But when is context actually the right tool for the job?
Think of data that many parts of your application need to access.
Yep.
The current theme, user authentication status, or language preferences.
Right.
Instead of passing that information down through props at every level, you can use context to make it available globally.
So context is like having a central information hub in our React app.
Exactly.
But you mentioned testing. Why is context potentially tricky in that regard?
When you use context, you're essentially creating implicit dependencies between components.
Okay.
If you're not careful, this can make it harder to isolate components during testing. One good practice is to use context only for data that truly needs to be global. If you're just passing data between a few closely related components, props are usually a better, more explicit option.
Okay, so it's all about striking that balance between convenience and maintainability.
Exactly.
Now, I imagine performance is a huge topic in React interviews, especially as applications grow larger. The document mentions code splitting. What is that, and why should I care?
Code splitting is like packing for a trip. Instead of stuffing everything into one giant suitcase, you organize your belongings into smaller bags, only taking what you need for each part of your journey.
Right.
In the context of React, it means splitting your code into smaller chunks that can be loaded on demand.
So instead of making the user download the entire application up front, we only load the code they need for the current view.
Precisely.
That's brilliant. How do we actually do that with React?
React makes code splitting quite elegant.
Okay.
You can use the dynamic import syntax, which lets you load modules asynchronously.
Okay.
So for example, if you have a component that's only used on a specific route, you can dynamically import it when the user navigates to that route, rather than loading it up front.
And while those modules are loading, we don't want to leave the user staring at a blank screen.
Uh-huh.
That's where the suspense component comes in, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
The suspense component lets you gracefully handle those asynchronous loading states. You can display a loading indicator or even a fallback component while the user waits for the code to load.
That's awesome. It's like having a smooth transition between scenes, even if some of the set pieces are still being wheeled into place. Now, before we take our final bow, expert speaker, I'd love to hear any last-minute wisdom you have for acing those React interviews.
Remember, technical skills are only part of the equation.
Right.
Show genuine passion, talk about what excites you about React, any cool projects you've worked on, what you're eager to learn.
Enthusiasm is contagious.
Absolutely. Also, be prepared to talk about your problem-solving process. Interviewers want to see how you think, how you approach challenges,
Right.
and how you debug those inevitable coding hiccups.
It's not about having all the answers memorized. It's about showing that you can think critically and find solutions.
Precisely. And lastly, don't underestimate the power of asking good questions.
Yes. It shows you're engaged, curious, and eager to learn. It's like that moment at the end of a play when the audience gets to ask the cast and crew questions.
Yeah.
It shows they were truly paying attention and want to dive deeper.
What a fantastic analogy. Asking insightful questions demonstrates that you're not just there for a job.
Right.
You're there to be a part of the React community and contribute to something bigger.
Well said, expert speaker. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive, from the fundamentals of React to advanced concepts like reconciliation, context, code splitting,
We really did.
and even touched upon the art of interviewing itself.
Yes.
So to our listener out there, you are now well equipped to step into that interview room with confidence. Remember, it's not just about what you know, but how you articulate it, your passion for the craft, and your willingness to learn and grow. Now go out there and knock those React interviews out of the park.
You got this.